Hi, my name is Louis Vega. I'm a geologist and a longtime resident of Kingman. I came to Mojave County in 1976 to work at Duval's Mineral Park mine. Through the years, I've worked on a number of geologic projects in Mojave County, including water issues. Because of my experience with the Mojave County geology, I've been asked to give presentations at various groups. And when I give these presentations, I realize that there are certain questions that are asked over and over again. This video is an attempt to discuss some of these questions that are frequently asked. This is a discussion of various hydrologic concepts that might not be familiar to all. Some of the questions that are asked include, how can we have a water problem in the Hualapai Basin? There is always someone that has done the math and calculated that there's a large amount of water that falls in Hualapai Basin. I have to inform them that the math is correct, but the hydrology is wrong. The follow-up question is usually, but isn't that how it works in other parts of the country? Yes, but this is the Basin and Range of the Southwest. Hydrology works different here. Let me explain. This is the map of the Western US. Inside the yellow line is a unique area of the US called the Basin and Range. What makes this area unique is the way it was formed and the resulting topography. Most mountain ranges are oriented north-south. Even the pioneers noticed this and described the mountains as a herd of giant caterpillars marching towards Mexico. The formation of the Basin and Range was caused by movement of the continental plates, but this is too technical for this presentation. So just imagine two large bulldozers pulling in opposite directions. This movement caused large fractures in the crust, forming blocks. Some of the blocks dropped, forming valleys, and some went up, forming mountains. The basins are shaped like giant bathtubs. These fractures are still active today. In 1975, there was a large earthquake in Nevada where a valley dropped about 3 feet. Hualapai Basin is one of these basins. It's oriented roughly north-south, and during the ice ages, the weather was much colder and there was more rainfall. This is my drawing of a cross-section of Hualapai Basin during the ice ages. There was a lot of rainfall, and the rivers flowing into the basin carried a lot of water. All this water filled the basins. The largest of these basins still has a remnant lake called the Great Salt Lake, located in Utah. It's not common knowledge, but at one time there was a glacier on San Francisco Peak near Flagstaff. Also, there was a variety of prehistoric fauna such as mastodons, bears, and other large mammals. Bones of some of these animals have been found in Mojave County and can be seen at the Mojave County Museum. But then the weather changed. It got hotter and drier. Less water entered the basin. Because of the climate change, certain processes not common in other parts of the country changed the hydrology of the basin. A crust formed on the basin. This crust is called caliche, shown in this slide as a yellow line. People that are not familiar with caliche, their question is, what is caliche and what difference does it make? Well, in desert regions where evaporation is high, the hot temperatures and low humidity suck the surface and near surface water out of the ground. As the water evaporates, caliche is formed. Caliche, sometimes called calcrete or hardpan, is calcium carbonate. The picture is of the caliche in my backyard in Kingman, where I had to rent a backhoe to dig holes to plant trees. The caliche was so hard I couldn't dig a hole with a shovel, and the trees that I planted died because their roots couldn't grow through the caliche. The caliche forms on or near the surface, but as the basin moves down and more sediments are deposited on top, the caliche accumulates into thick layers. This picture is of a single layer I found exposed in a wash in La Paz County that was over 20 feet thick. If the caliche seals the soil, how does water reach the aquifer? Well, in today's hydrology, water has to get below the caliche to make it to the aquifer. And the best places for this to happen is near the mountain fronts where caliche is the thinnest. Let me explain on the whiteboard. Let's make a sketch of Hualapai Basin, starting with the mountains and the slope of the mountains coming down to the basin. This is bedrock. So the water can't go through the bedrock. As it rains in the mountains during the ice ages, we had a lot of rainfall coming in from the mountains, making it down to the basin and filling the basin with water. As the weather changed, there was less water coming in from the mountains. With erosion coming from the mountains and less water, the bigger rocks and boulders get deposited right at the range front, so the water can pass through this into the basin until caliche starts to develop. Now the sediments would start building up in layers. The water that comes in from the mountains will go through these coarse sediments into the aquifer. The water that doesn't go into the coarse sediments and gets on the surface of the basin evaporates and forms caliche. More sediments come in from the mountains, forming another layer, and the same thing happens again. Water coming in can make it past the coarse sediments into the aquifer, but any water that goes on the surface is evaporated, forming more caliche. So this continues until the basin is essentially sealed. The center of the basin is sealed because of the caliche, and the only way to get to the aquifer is along the coarse sediments that are deposited along the range front. So the water that we see on the surface of Red Lake doesn't infiltrate into the aquifer? That is correct. Any water that makes it past the mountain fronts will evaporate. In the case of injection wells, like the one at the city water waste treatment plant, the well has to be deeper than the caliche to do any good. This is a picture of one of the recharge basins the county and city are building. Before they decided on the best location, they studied the area and drilled holes to be sure the sediments would accept the water. They built a large apron to collect the water and a central area with coarse boulders to better enable the water to infiltrate. Cattle tanks and ponds that aren't placed and prepared correctly won't be successful recharge basins. So let's go back to our cross section and take a look at why the location of the recharge basins is very important. If you put a recharge basin in this area, it will collect the water and the water can infiltrate through the coarse sediments and make it all the way down to the aquifer. If you build a recharge basin in the center of the basin, water will still come into it because you have water coming on the surface, and it will fill up this cattle tank or basin, but the water will not infiltrate because of the caliche layers. But I've heard people say that the water level in their well has gone up. Doesn't that mean that the water in the basin is rising and we don't have a water problem? The way water moves in a basin is complicated. Imagine a swimming pool filled with water. If you put a pump in the middle of the pool and start pumping, the water goes down and you can see it go down evenly in the entire pool. Now fill the pool with sand. When you start pumping, the water around the pump will go down faster than the water at the edges because the sand slows the movement of water. Now imagine that same pool filled with a mixture of sand and fine silt. The water is slowed down even more, and you might have different water levels at different locations of the pool. Well, now imagine Hualapai Basin, thousands of times larger than a swimming pool, filled with a wide variety of sediments and volcanic rocks, being pumped by many large and low volume wells. You can see that taking one measurement at one location doesn't tell what's happening in the basin. You need many monitor wells and years of readings to establish a trend. In this chart, you can see that in certain years, the water has gone up and down in others, but the overall trend is down. It has dropped 80 feet in 54 years. How can we explain the jagged nature of water movement? We need to talk about the concept of a cone of depression. When you have a pump taking water out of the aquifer has to move water to replace the amount taken out by the pump. Water in the aquifer moves slower than the water being taken out by the pump. So a cone of depression is formed. When the pump is turned off, the cone of depression would eventually recover. So if you were measuring water levels near the pump, it would give you very misleading readings. This is a map with north to the right and a cross section in the lower part. This area is North Kingman, where the city water field is located. The green dots are the city wells. The blue lines are elevations of the water table. Notice that the city wells being pumped have formed a cone of depression in the area of where the city well field is. If you were to measure the water level in any well around the city well field, it's impacted by the cone of depression of the city well field and isn't an accurate representation of the basin. As pumping continues, the water level will drop and eventually be separated by the bedrock high in the area of Long Mountain, shown on the right side of the cross section. This slide shows the Hualapai aquifer. The yellow line shows the extent of the aquifer as it is today. Eventually, pumping will cause the aquifer to drop and be separated into two, shown by the dashed red line. In summary, let's review some of the concepts that we've talked about. Hualapai Basin is part of the Basin and Range desert region of the Southwest. The low rainfall, high heat, and low humidity causes caliche to form on the surface and subsurface of the basin. Caliche is an impermeable barrier to water infiltration. Infiltration occurs in areas of no caliche or thin caliche along range fronts. Water moves slowly through the sediments, forming cones of depression around pumping wells. A single reading of water level isn't meaningful to determine the water levels in the basin. Recharge efforts must take into account the desert conditions of the Basin and Range to be successful. This is the end of my video. If you have additional questions or would like to sponsor a presentation at a group meeting, please contact Supervisor Travis Lingenfelter's office to schedule. Thank you.